All right. I think I just wanted today to talk about foreign vendors operating in the United States and just different security topics. Um, I tend to like to talk about computer security. Um, it's not an area that I'm an expert in at all. I got into this space because I had an interest in data mining and data scraping back in the 2010s. Um, and that led me into a rabbit hole of all the different social issues to do with data mining. So this predated, and in my world at least, in the 2016 election is when people kind of understood what data scraping and data mining were and kind of tended to associate them with like ugly words or ugly thoughts. And this was because of that Facebook scandal uh, with the Cambridge Analytica, which, if you don't know, the scandal there was in that era, Facebook had all of the like, and then you still see this. So anytime you see something that's like, enter your astrological birth date to look at your compatibility, that's just phishing your date of birth. Anytime it would be, you know, maybe an app that's like, hey, reunite with like your high school buddies, like entering where you went to high school, another phishing app. So social media was doing this in mass. Um, and basically that, Cambridge Analytica scandal was just, to me, that was just one data point, but that's where the popular mind kind of became familiar with this. And then I could just, yap a little bit about what's interesting about the data scraping laws is that there is something called CFAA that governs it. And this is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And yeah, right here. The key things that trigger CFAA is that access without authorization and access exceeding authorization. So the implication of that, or what it's called, I took the law class on it, and basically with CFAA, it's what's called an overbroad statute, and so that means that anybody can bring a case that's CFAA related, and so it was something that was created in the 1980s to thwart the possibility of hackers hacking military systems. It was left overbroad. You would have an overbroad statute if you want the judge to sort of form the case law around what the market is doing. That's probably I'm not a legal expert, but that's like my best understanding of kind of what's going on there. Uh, Now, this came to a head in, I think, 2016 or thereabouts, when LinkedIn sued this company called HiQ. And HiQ was farming LinkedIn profiles. And so you've seen since the 2016 era, so 2008 till 2016, the companies were trying to get you onto the web. They're trying to get you onto their platform, using their platform as much as possible. And um, I could go in two directions actually with this video, but I think I'll try to stick to the security side of it. But basically, 2016 is where these companies started to allege, like LinkedIn did, like, hey, our data is our core asset, which isn't their data; it's the user's data technically. But you make a license to LinkedIn, and that's how they claim it's their data. And they're sort of saying like, hey, Q doesn't have a license to this data. It's against our terms of service, and they scraped our systems in order to access it. And I think in this particular case, HiQ basically said, no, we didn't even have to log in. We just literally visited it like we're, a web crawler, for example. And that's generally been a sort of a litmus of how to test if something's legally okay to scrape or not. Um, and this is without me saying that all of what's interesting or fascinating about all of these data scraping cases is that, this is kind of where we are now in the AI era. So, um, yeah, so basically I'm like looking up to see if there are any kind of cases that would relate now to this AI era that we're in, because basically, if you think about it, the AI models themselves were trained on this sort of CFAA type of landscape. where you're sort of exceeding your authorization to get as much data as possible. Maybe you're paying for data sets. Maybe you're just training on Wikipedia, but you're probably not. Just why you saw like Elon go after X, or, Meta claims, because of its data, it's primed for AI and so forth. I failed to mention, though, that the reason that this high tap case was notable is because the judge struck it down, and this is why it says it's a landmark case. It's because the judge is like, you can't really use CFAA to enforce competition, and that's the main function of what you guys are doing. So I think on the technical, they got off because, HiQ claimed, hey, we're just doing the equivalent of like a search engine. And then LinkedIn and many companies since that 2016 era had since patched their systems to either have at least a terms of service that's anti-scrape, or they're doing something that's more of a technical barrier that says like, hey, we're going to make it hard for you to scrape. So if you want to do something like rotate a residential proxy, now we've got you, or we have some kind of better legal case against you. And so we could actually go and evaluate what are some of these ongoing cases, because if you think about it, the AI itself is based on kind of these types of I keep failing to find the word, like fringes or types of legal statutes. And so, there's cases where I think the one was that the stock photo, there's like the stock photo company was found out that their images were being trained on. Here's a music group against Anthropic. Let me see if there's a stock photo. What about the stock photo case? What was that stock photo? That was Getty Images. Yeah. So Getty Images was like, hey, you're training stability versus stability AI. And then let's see who won that one. Appeal posture. So it's ongoing. Filed in 2025. They allowed the claims to proceed. And yeah, so it relates back to this whole scraping and data mining issue. But yeah, so that's kind of how I got into security, going back to kind of that topic. It's interesting to look at kind of these ongoing evolutions in data, but back then, part of, let's say, pursuing data scraping or data mining was being kind of clever about systems. So I already mentioned how, like, back in the day, Facebook, was kind of this game of like, someone said, hey, try our astrology app, and that's how they get your birthday, or reunite with your high school friends, and that's how they get your like graduation year. So, or what high school you went to, which are obviously security questions for your banking. So there's methods and modes of thinking, and that's the social engineering aspect, but there's also, methods and modes of thinking in the technical that, became interesting to me. So for example, we'll go find this one up, but it's pretty easy to understand, exploitation, triangulation. So back in the day, Tinder used to be this app that, basically, let's see if we can find it. It's a really old, let's see. Yeah, 2014 was when this guy found it. So Tinder used to expose your exact distance to other users. So they would give you like this long, this might be it. Yeah, this is it. So Tinder used to give you this really long floating point decimal, and you can see right here, he has the exact exploit. So they give you a really long floating point decimal. So it meant if you created 3 profiles of attractive people who all had a swipe right, that basically you could triangulate a person's real-time location. So this type of thing became interesting to me. Now I'm going to make some jumps, but I'm just sort of saying that's how I became interested in security. Then, as being like an operator of doing sysadmin work as well, it's relevant to me. So that's my sort of overlap to the security world. And I said it in passing with sysadmin work, but that actually dominates my time. So I have to spend a lot of time kind of reading about latest supply chain attacks on the NPM ecosystem. That's why on this channel I've kind of mentioned before, like you need to do min release age and your NPM RC. So I have to, because I'm trying to run an internet business, I have to think about security, but there's other interesting aspects of how security, I think, will continue to, play into these AI ecosystems. So I talked to a business operator recently. This was like, you can kind of tell when you're talking to somebody who is worth money. The guy in particular, he basically um, indicated he was head of sales, and like you could kind of tell he ran an operation of a certain size because he had an HR department. And what this guy told me he was doing was he was getting rid of all of his vendor applications, so where he'd pay for per seat. So he had Monday.com, which is a CRM application. He was getting rid of it, and instead, what he was doing was he was copying open source and repurposing it for his business. So for him, it was a $30,000 a year expense, but he said that he found that anything that was kind of that type of expense, he was now going to vibe code. And so the problem with this is that I sort of, in my commentary, I think, you can remember the 2000s, 2000 to 2010, when you downloaded a lot more software onto your desktop. These days, maybe one of the greatest attack vectors is if you use VS Code, installing the VS Code extension. So the problem with using other people's software is that, like, while yes, you can do virus scans on it and all that type of stuff, ultimately, when you go deeper into the security world and you go look at some of these exploits, I particularly like Low Level on YouTube, so we can give him a little shout out. Let's see if we can find that. Basically, what he sort of indicates, there's a whole category of code that just doesn't, what it does is it minimizes its footprint, so it's harder to detect. And then it reuses functions in your call stack. It will analyze the bytecode, and it's crazy. So this is Low Level. If you're interested in security, I highly recommend checking him out. His recent episode was on how they're hacking headphones, which is kind of hilarious, but in general, the type of commentaries that he makes is how devastating AI has kind of become for cybersecurity. And I remarked to a guy at, I think it was the Linux Foundation conference, of like, I was like, man, couldn't you just train on the CVE database? And possibly this is what the whole Mythos model, Classic model, had done. So the idea is that, go back to virus scanners and installing software, like the virus scanner might not be perfect at detecting things, especially if the payload size of code is like a tiny malicious line. There's probably ways to disguise it, is kind of the point, to evade detection. Now, let's get into something that's slightly different, and then I will kind of circle back to where I started this whole video, which is on foreign vendors operating inside the U.S. And by the way, I'm making this video because it's like I could rant in text, and I think that people would misunderstand me, and it's unfortunate, like, because so many people are able to just do text. Now I had to learn video and be comfortable in front of a camera. I have to be comfortable looking at so many of my videos. I'm like, man, my hair is just messy. And I guess, I feel like that reflects poorly on me, but that's a separate topic. What I'm talking about, though, when it comes to something I was doing recently, was we're pursuing a license modeling. And so when you go into software and you want to do licensing, it's a really hard thing to do. And so let me see if I can go find something that is related to licensing startup vendors. But basically, like, we were researching, and I was trying to research, like, should I build this licensing system, or can we outsource it? And then, I had landed on this listing. So, like, I think Keygen sounds like one that I remember landing on. And when you go to their site, and you go to pricing, because that's at the end of the day what matters. And it's like, damn, it's like it's basically they're doing the Auth0 model where they have, they charge per volume, and then they charge you, it's like 300 a month. And it's like, oof. And like here I go doing the same thing that this guy, I didn't even mention the problem with this other operator that I had mentioned. So he's this like, well-off guy who's trying to bring in an in-source software now from open source. And I'm sort of indicating that you can't really scan everything. And I'll circle back to this licensing thing in a moment. That is, you can't scan everything. We're going to go back to this era of the 2000s to the 2010, where people would install software and invariably they'd get a virus. They would corrupt their machine. They'd have to reinstall Windows. And this was kind of a pretty common enough occurrence that's when iOS locked down their ecosystem pretty hard. And so if you have people kind of freely creating software, whether it's from prompting or using an open source base, what I'm sort of suggesting is that it's not impossible for software to sort of evade detection. Because if you look at kind of the tea leaves and what this guy low level is saying, he's basically saying that like AI is getting so good, the payload can be relatively small. It can just hijack existing code in your code at the bytecode level, which is like pretty wild to think about. But I personally was kind of experiencing this other class of software that has to do with virus scanners, and that I was pursuing a licensing model. And as I was building it, I was thinking, well, what happens if somebody violates the license? And what was interesting was, as I kind of pursued this notion of like, well, and this is going to sound bad to some people in the industry, but I'm like, maybe we should just encrypt the software once the violation's been detected. They can decrypt it easily. That way we won't have to payload them a new license. And as soon as I went down that path, AI kind of like said, no, that sounds like ransomware. Like you're going to get, I think it mentioned like CrowdStrike, for example. They're a public big company in this space, but like, CrowdStrike's going to do its endpoint detection resolution on you and say, no, this looks like ransomware, and it's going to blacklist you across every organization, and then you're not going to be able to get into the market. So the key word there is endpoint detection. And so we can go look up CrowdStrike. And so basically, endpoint security, I used to, when I was learning about this, like I was ignorant, as anybody starting out is, and not that it's a starting out, but even just familiarizing with what's going on in the industry. So basically, what endpoint detection is this notion that like you're going to get a log at the kernel layer of an operating system, and that log is going to have every user activity. Yeah, so I think what I meant to say, you have this like event viewer on Windows, for example, and it will show you a log of everything that's happening on your system. So the way that endpoint detection works is basically this, I don't know if this CrowdStrike page is going to really show it well. But what it does is it embeds yourself. I think CrowdStrike is so known for this, they don't even bother to explain what endpoint detection is. This other site, Huntress, might have a better example. So endpoints are kind of, looked at, in my best understanding of endpoint detection, it's monitoring the logs, it's looking for anomalies in user system activity, and then it's trying to report on those anomalies. So this requires like kind of subsuming a huge amount of data logs of the organization. And I remember talking to a guy that worked at it's a very profitable space right now. And the reason for that, this is kind of where I wanted to get to with foreign vendors, is the reason for that is due to insider threats. So I think I saw a video, and I'm not totally sure, but I think that it probably was the case that, you had maybe up until 2010, the notion of a perimeter defense. Well, just air gap the system so they can't steal like the fighter jet schemas and plans, or just monitor the firewall, make sure nobody gets in. But then what started to happen was you had all these exfiltrations of data by people that had access from the inside. And so they wanted to kind of start to understand, well, how do we monitor our employees? And obviously this like coincided with like the remote work shifts, as well as, trying to do offshore, offshoring and working with large chains of vendors. So, I was sitting down. I think what inspired this is that I was sitting down at a bar watching some FIFA World Cup action, and he was with a guy that like worked in the space. And like as he was like telling me about like he called himself the hall monitor at any organization. So if they start to see anything weird on your device, like they're going to report it or escalate it or triage it. And so I talked to a guy that was in this space in Canada, and like I said, quite profitable. And he sort of remarked to me, because we chatted about, how they actually, manage to operate on massive amounts of logs, because you could imagine the computers generate a massive amount of events. So there's a lot of technical things you have to do to efficiently digest logs. But he said that developers often are, they chiefly, developers look like they're intruders, because developers are doing things that naturally conflict, or, they're doing things that hack the system, so to speak, in order to do their job. So I found that interesting. And as a fun anecdote, I think in the same way that in endpoint detection realm, developer looks like a hacker, so too, there was this recent idea that the Chinese were conducting distillation attacks. And what I found so good is that, basically their distillation attacks basically consisted of them, was just using benchmarks. So they basically were like testing benchmarks. And I'm not sure that I'm going to find the reference in here, but normal benchmarking and evaluation. So they basically issue a series of benchmark tests at Claude, for example, and that's how they're able to get things out. And so I guess I've laid the ground enough to sort of suggest, and go back to this topic of foreign vendors. I mean, what triggered me as I was talking to this guy at the bar was a little bit of PTSD, because it's like, I feel like sometimes you go work at these companies and you feel like you're just showing up to do work to collect pay, but you feel like not a threat, but you feel definitely like you're evaluated. You feel like you're monitored. And it makes the whole working environment super demoralizing. It's not just that, it's also that you have like this notion that they're thinking about AI, how AI replaces you. And then it's not just that, it's this notion of they're thinking about how to offshore your job. So when you layer on this many problems, I mean, and then the whole industry of endpoint detection is based on this notion that there's insider threats. And the only reason, well, certainly that cobbling together a giant list of vendors and cobbling together and especially offshoring them and making it from a global pool means that your whole notion of jurisdiction is, you might have them onshored and on like a visa and, where they live type of thing, but you definitely have people who ideologically don't care as much. They're not as invested as much. They don't have ownership as much. And so what I find interesting is how the industry kind of is pursuing a system where, kind of in the words of the World Bank, saying that in the future, you will own nothing and be happy. It's almost like corporates are kind of pursuing this notion of decreased ownership. They're sort of saying that they want people in their companies to have ownership. I know as a contractor that like, often that's the distinction they make between me and somebody else, is that, oh, I'm a contractor. You're a contractor. You don't have ownership over systems like employment. But like, is there really any ownership when you're just offshoring people or onshoring people? I mean, maybe there is. You're trying to get ownership at a cheaper rate with a huge cultural gap in between. So it's like, it doesn't make sense. obviously the onshored workers are going to say that they can culturally assimilate, but do they? Do you really have time to? You have to do a job that's really intensive. Um, like or are you even incentivized to care? I don't really think so. I think that there's a whole lack of assimilation and there's a whole intentional lack of care. I think the idea of these companies is they sort of want to pursue as much as possible, a clean extraction of labor and then a complete disposal of the worker. I think that's kind of what we're feeling when we feel the AI replacement, the global workforce replacement. And so it's very frustrating to me because like in order to do my last job, I felt like I had to literally hack my system and get around security guardrails. And I've done this throughout my career where I'll sort of hack maybe like, let's say we have a long business procedure that would follow it, whereas we could just get away with prototyping something very quickly. So I've always been a fan of those techniques, but I think what I experienced was more like I worry that industries become so restrictive because it's relied so much on offshoring. Um, and I don't even want to talk trash about, the amount of vetting that I had to go through, the carelessness and using vendor chains just to handle my personal data. There's no order that can come from this type of arrangement. And I find it interesting too when we go to like the whole notion that I kind of had tapped upon, which are that these AI companies, here's, the docket that's the wrong chat. The docket it had come up with, um, was really interesting, when it comes to, all the cases that are pending or ongoing, in terms of lawsuits related to probably data scraping. Um, and basically what these AI companies have done. And so it's just from a security point of view, and the other interesting area in security, so that's the law and society view, is that these guys are scraping en masse. There's these interesting laws that were kind of there that kind of put a pressure on competition just long enough for like I guess the big tech companies to pursue, data scraping en masse in order to compile it into an AI model. Obviously, it's not without lawsuits. And then you go to these concepts of AI kind of furthering this economic, where people want to sort of, I talk about onshoring, but people now want to insource, their vendor chain. So you have these offshore vendors, which cause security issues. Now you have proprietors wanting to insource software into their supply chain to get away from costs eating their wallet. And I think it's going to result in security issues. It's really interesting, like across the board, right? It's just security issues. You have these global workforces and vendor chains that cause security issues. You have a lack of ownership. You have an increase in automation. You have an increase in maybe business operator certainty. Um, And then you have these supply chains of like endpoint detection that I guess I'm sort of saying I've seen them in practice, and they're so restrictive. You're just going to feel like you're working in the gulag. Um, and yeah, I mean, that kind of remark actually came recently from someone working at Meta, because they're being literally monitored as they work. They know that it's like this we've onshored the third world factory, and that's now what the workplace feels like. And you have to remember that what these tech companies are doing, they're 25 to 30% of the GDP. It will have a downward pressure on how all the other companies have to behave in order to kind of be competitive. So I just think it's an interesting set of topics. I like to tap into it. And like I said, I was just chatting with a guy at the bar, and, he's kind of in this space. And I was like, I kind of found myself, ranting a bit. I'm like, man, like you'd think that the companies would just learn eventually. Maybe we should stop. Maybe we should increase ownership, and, decrease reliance on foreign vendors. And it's not about people from different countries or outsiders or foreigners. It's just more a game of ownership. Um, and I can sort of speak from that, having been in another country myself and kind of knowing you can care about the other culture and try to learn about the other culture, but you won't be like native. And I think in the US, we're just maybe a bit, we're very welcoming. which is maybe good, but yeah, there's security issues with all of that. And it's frustrating because it also obviously causes someone like myself or any profile of a software person, friction economically. And that's, it's very frustrating when you personally encounter friction and it's also at a systemic disadvantage, or it's something that companies are taking risk wise that the rest of the market maybe doesn't feel yet until something happens in one shape or form or another. So just wanted to talk about that one today. And until next time, talk to you next